the summer of 1765, the ministry of George Grenville was replaced, and word arrived that the British colonies in North America were in a state of unrest brought about by the recently passed Stamp Act. There were two potential ways for the government to respond, both fraught with danger. Using the military to enforce the act risked inciting rebellion not only in the colonies, but also in the trading towns of Great Britain. At the same time, however, there was concern that a repeal would encourage residents of the British Empire to resist new legislation in the future. It fell to a new ministry to decide on a course of action. That ministry was led by the Marquess of Rockingham.
Charles Watson-Wentworth was born on May 13, 1730, son of Mary and Thomas Watson-Wentworth. He was educated at Westminster School and St. John's College, Cambridge, and became second Marquess of Rockingham upon the death of his father on December 14, 1750. He took his seat in the House of Lords the following spring and married Mary Bright in early 1752. In mid-July 1765, Rockingham became First Lord of the Treasury. A general letter, co-written by Rockingham, was sent to ports and manufacturing towns across Britain on December 6, 1765. 3 weeks later, Rockingham held a meeting at his home to discuss the Stamp Act. In attendance were First Lord of the Admiralty John Percival, Earl of Egmont, Secretary of State for the Southern Department General Henry Seymour Conway, Chancellor of the Exchequer William Dowdeswell, President of the Board of Trade and Foreign Plantations William Legge, Earl of Dartmouth, and Attorney General Charles York, each of whom was responsible for enforcing the Stamp Act.
An idea was put forth to have an act of Parliament stating its legislative power over the colonies. They also proposed modifying the Stamp Act, such as by making it payable in the colony's local currency rather than sterling, or having violators tried in courts of record instead of vice admiralty courts.
Throughout late January 1766, petitions came in from merchants in Britain claiming that the Stamp Act had rendered the colonists unable to pay off the debts that were owed to them. The opposition was aware that the merchants had been spurred by Rockingham. Regardless, he held another meeting at his home the evening after the first petitions were received. This time, the attendees were Conway, Dowdeswell, Paymaster General Charles Townshend, and Secretary of State for the Northern Department Augustus Henry Fitzroy, Duke of Grafton. It was decided that the Stamp Act would be repealed and a declaratory act would be passed, asserting that Parliament, quote, hath and of a right ought to have full power and authority to make laws and statutes of sufficient force and validity to bind the colonies and people of America in all cases whatsoever. York wanted it revised to specifically mention taxation, but Rockingham wrote to him that, quote, it is our firm resolution in the House of Lords that that word must not be inserted. The summer after the repeal of the Stamp Act and the passage of the Declaratory Act, Rockingham was dismissed as First Lord of the Treasury. In May 1767, Rockingham wrote to the Speaker of the Assembly of Massachusetts. This letter is significant in that it outlines his position on the colonial matter. Quote, a system of arbitrary rule over the colonies I would not adopt on this side. Neither would I do otherwise than strenuously resist when attempts were made to throw off that dependency to which the colonies ought to submit, not only for the advantage of this country, but for their own real happiness and safety. 3 years later, Rockingham delivered a speech in the House of Lords in which he urged moderation in reconciling with the colonies. He pointed out that Parliament was itself divided over what measures were necessary, and the colonists were merely asserting the privileges that British subjects considered their birthright. Rockingham unsuccessfully opposed the 1774 bill for regulating the government of Massachusetts, and supported the motion to withdraw troops from Boston the following year. He subsequently opposed the bill to restrict the trade of Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Connecticut, and Rhode Island.
On July 4th, 1776, the United States declared themselves independent of Great Britain, with one of their grievances being that Parliament was, quote,
declaring themselves invested with power to legislate for us in all cases whatsoever. The following autumn, King George III opened a new session of Parliament, and the Lords delivered an address of thanks. An amendment was proposed advising him to inquire into the aforementioned grievances. When the amendment was rejected, Rockingham made a note of his dissent. In March 1778, the Lords debated the newly formed alliance between France and the United States. Rockingham argued that they should recognize the independence of the United States and cited the growing expense of the war. Frederick Howard, Earl of Carlisle, General Sir Henry Clinton, and William Eden Esquire responded to the alliance by issuing a proclamation that the British would intensify the war effort. Rockingham urged the Lords to disavow the manifesto, arguing that it was barbaric and pointing out that Britain and its Caribbean colonies were vulnerable to counterattack. The Lords voted against the motion and, not surprisingly, Rockingham was among those who signed the dissent. In March 1782, 5 months after the surrender at Yorktown, the House of Lords was adjourning when he was approached by Lord Chancellor Edward Baron Thurlow. The two sat back down and remained in the House alone for the next hour and a half, during which time Thurlow said that he was authorized by King George to ask if Rockingham would form a ministry. 2 days later, Rockingham answered that he would do so if King George agreed to independence for the United States. By the end of the month, Rockingham was once again First Lord of the Treasury, an office he would occupy for the last 3 months of his life. He died of influenza on July 1st and was buried in the choir of York Minster.
The Marquess of Rockingham served as Prime Minister of Great Britain twice in his life. Both times, he represented a retreat from the policy of his more hardline predecessor when it came to Britain and America. First, he was willing to address their grievances while still maintaining British control. Upon his return to power almost 2 decades later, relations had deteriorated to the point where his solution was independence.
If you like our videos, please like, subscribe, and comment below.